All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Table Talk, where we discuss the supernatural biblical events and a whole lot more. And I am joined today by my returning guest, who is a biblical archaeologist. He's a fellow at the Biblical Institute of Anthropology. He's an author and a scholar, and he's got his hands full. He's always on the go and he's always doing things. So, welcome back, Dr. Aaron Judkins. I appreciate you coming on with me again.
Yes, thanks for having me back. It's an honor.
Well, last time that you were on with Dr. Judd Burton as well. We had a good time talking about your latest book, your groundbreaking book. I have it here so that our listening audience and those that are watching can take a look at the book, and we'll put the links at the bottom later on. But Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia and the Watchers, a rather interesting book. I might go ahead and add to that, right?
Right.
It's a pretty cool book. I'm actually trying to wrap my head around the details that you both write about Gobekli Tepe here, because as you know, we're going to be traveling this June to this specific site, Gobekli Tepe, and it's like a dream come true for me because I've always been very intrigued with this site in particular, and we're going to be visiting some other areas as well. Karahan Tepe, I think I mentioned to you. So it's going to be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Um, have you ever been to Gobekli Tepe? I think you said you hadn't, right?
No, I tried to get there back in 2013, but when I was in Eastern Turkey searching for Noah's Ark on Greater Ararat. So
Right,
after I finished up with that expedition, I was going to go over to Gobekli Tepe.
right.
But in 2013, the situation was different.
Yeah,
There was a lot of Kurds fleeing over the border from Syria.
right,
They were being chemically attacked, and Gobekli Tepe is not too far from the border, and
right.
so they closed down the site and they evacuated. So it was everything was closed at that time. But
Wow.
eventually, I'm going to get over there. I don't know when, but
You've
I
got
would
to
love to
do
go
it.
see him.
You've got to do it, especially if you wrote about it. I have to get my hands on another copy of your book because I would love to have it available. Because if I happen to see one of the main archaeologists there, I'd love to hand them your book, like we talked about last time. So is
Yeah,
that okay with you?
it is. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I'm interested in what they would think about some of these new theories that I'm proposing in the book.
Right.
Uh, it really it really pushes against the conventional narrative in several areas,
Yeah.
and so it's not mainstream, it's not conventional. But I think this is important when we're investigating sites like Gobekli Tepe and to put forth new theories. And I've heard Dr. Lee Clare on camera when he was doing an interview said that they may not agree with everything, but they're open to hearing other interpretations. And I, my hope is that they would consider this book, Decoding Gobekli Tepe, because I think it answers some questions that they at least need to consider
Mhm.
and investigate further. And we address all those in the book.
I recently came across an episode on Discovery Plus. Just was randomly checking to see if there was a documentary on Gobekli Tepe, and there was. And it was pretty cool because some of the things, it must have been maybe an hour episode or something to that effect. I don't know if you've seen that before, but it was pretty interesting to me because some of the things that they were talking about actually resonated with some things that you do write in the book. I mean, not that they said that that's what it was, but for the most part, they said, some believe da 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 da, that kind of thing. And then it was interesting because I was like, well, I know that this is some of the things that I've been reading in the book. So I don't know if you've seen that program at all.
Well, do you remember the name of it?
I think it was. something along the lines of uh oh goodness, I should have been more prepared. I didn't even know I was going to bring this up to you today. I'll find out and I'll let you know.
Yeah.
I'll shoot you an email. I'll send you maybe the link of it or something. But I want to say it's something like Discovering Gobekli Tepe, something to that
Hmm.
effect. And it's on Discovery Plus. You need to kind of like find it in the section where they have the
I
documentaries, but I highly
probably
recommend
have
it.
I probably have not seen it.
Yeah.
Uh, so I would be interested to watch it.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. But okay, last time that you and Dr. Judd were on the show, you gave us some really great insights on Gobekli Tepe. And perhaps there's some new viewers that are watching tonight and they're tuning in and they are not aware what in the world is Gobekli Tepe, what is this place about, what's the interests. So we before we kind of get into some of the details, can you first give a little bit of an overview of what this site is all about?
So Gobekli Tepe is a site in southeastern Turkey. Now,
Yeah.
the modern day pronunciation now is Turkey A, but this is in biblical Anatolia,
Yeah.
Asia Minor in the Bible. So this particular site was it was discovered. It was first surveyed, I think, in the 1960s, but mislabeled as a Byzantine cemetery, so it was dismissed. It wasn't until the early 90s where Dr. Klaus Schmidt was in the area excavating, and he went over to investigate that site and immediately knew it was Neolithic, which is Stone Age. And so he began excavations there, I think in the mid 90s. And what they initially discovered really shocked archaeologists. Is just considered the world's oldest temple. Now, a lot of scholars will dismiss the word temple. They don't like to use that terminology, but in the just the overall sense of the site, it's been termed as the world's oldest temple complex, dating back to the conventional dating of the Neolithic, which is Stone Age, and they put it around 9,600 years ago, 10,000 years ago.
Okay, so this is a pretty old site compared
It's
to others that have been excavated or discovered
yeah,
in recent times, I should say, right? Does
right.
that sound right?
On on the conventional timeline, it's considered the oldest megalithic architecture ever discovered. So, in other words, this site really kind of turned everything upside down because in the textbooks they teach an evolutionary viewpoint of mankind's origins,
Mm-hmm.
and so they teach that mankind, were hunter gatherers.
Mm-hmm.
They eventually began to develop agriculture, which led to farming, which led to a settled, sedentary lifestyle. They formed communities. And as a result of all that, religion came about because of the people in the communities. Gobekli Tepe, really, the findings there are just the opposite. One, we have megalithic architecture in the Neolithic that wasn't supposed to be there, according to what we have known.
Mm-hmm.
Why is because we have Stone Age people who are supposedly before the invention of the wheel and before the invention of pottery, yet they're building megalithic architecture. This shows a division of labor and organization, which is not what the Neolithic people were supposed to have this capability or technology to do this kind of building
Mm-hmm.
at the time. And two, it puts religious ideology before the advent of agriculture and
Mm-hmm.
sedentary lifestyles and communities.
Mm-hmm.
So we have religious ideology, which is bringing the people together at Gobekli Tepe first before all
Right,
this other stuff happens. So
right.
this is the two oddities that we see at Gobekli Tepe, and it really shocked archaeologists when they first discovered it.
Yeah. And I want to get to that in just a moment. And I also want to ask you something kind of like off the bat too, just to get it out of the way for, again, people that are watching this for the first time are probably thinking, well, why talk about Gobekli Tepe again, right? But I want to pose a question to you that I'm sure it's been asked of you before. Why should we be interested as Christians, as a born again believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, Bible believing person? Why should we be interested in some of these ancient archaeological sites like Gobekli Tepe, for example, or like, all the other sites that have come up through the years, and people have excavated it? Why should it be of interest to us? I mean, whether we like archaeology or not. I mean, I'm no archaeologist, but I gotta say, this kind of stuff fascinates me, especially when it solidifies the Bible and the stories of the Bible, right? So why would you say a Christian should be interested in knowing a little bit more about these archaeological ancient sites?
Well, most people are familiar with archaeology coming out of Israel. This is
Yeah.
in the land of the Bible. A lot of people are not familiar with anything outside that, outside of Israel. And Göbekli Tepe, of course, is in Turkey. But again, Turkey is biblical Asia Minor. This is where Paul traveled on his missionary journeys. This is where the very first churches were started, such as the site of Ephesus.
Yeah.
And we know that as the book of Ephesians that Paul writes.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of history in Turkey that people don't know about. But even other countries, Iran, ancient Persia, Iraq, ancient Babylon, Egypt. These are just a few of the places that archaeology has confirmed the biblical narrative, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament. Now, most of the New Testament things are found within Israel, but a lot of the Old Testament has been confirmed outside the land of the Bible. So we're talking about names of people, biblical names, places, dates, events, battles have been independently confirmed in archaeology. Most of these discoveries are just found by normal everyday people, landowners, etc. But they do confirm these events that have been written down in the Old Testament. And Göbekli Tepe is important because what I wanted to do was try to understand where Göbekli Tepe fit in the time frame of the Old Testament.
Right.
And so these were people that they were real people. They, lived this life of a kind of what we would consider primitive lifestyle in this area. But when you look at Göbekli Tepe and you read it in the book Decoding Gobekli Tepe, we try to answer these questions: who were the people there? Why were they there? And what were they doing there?
Mm-hmm.
And when you understand the biblical chronology of the history of nations and the history of the people that came out of Mesopotamia, there is some cultural connections that are linked to Gobekli Tepe that I make allusions to in the book. It's an interesting enough tie to Gobekli Tepe that we have to question the timeline of events, and this is precisely what we're doing in the book is putting forth new theories that that we're seeing at Gobekli Tepe, such as the symbols on the stones and the timeline. But if there's a cultural connection to Mesopotamia, specifically to either the Luwians or the Sumerians,
Hmm.
then we have to look at this evidence. Some of the evidence is circumstantial, and we do understand that.
Yeah.
That's because a lot of Gobekli Tepe is still under the ground. Only 10% of Gobekli Tepe of the site has been excavated.
Hmm.
So the majority remains under the ground. A lot of people don't know this, but the majority of Egypt is still under the sands. Only 1% of Egypt has formally been excavated,
Yeah.
ancient Egypt, which means 99% still buried under the sand. So there's still a lot that we don't know. But what we do know that's coming out of the ground at Gobekli Tepe, I think, causes us to relook at the site uh, through a biblical lens frame, which is what we do, a biblical perspective,
Hmm.
and I think it gives us a little bit more clarity on the site. So that's why it's important to modern day Christians and to people who have just a general interest, is because a lot of times these sites do have biblical ties and they do confirm
Hmm.
the biblical narrative. So I don't like to use the word prove, but they can confirm and fill
Hmm.
in the color of that time period. And so this is exactly the things that we're seeing in Gobekli Tepe.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I had heard or maybe read somewhere that uh, Gobekli Tepe was deliberately covered. It may have been deliberately covered, and that it was just, obviously discovered, like you mentioned, um, not really
There's
that long ago, but yeah.
there's some debate and scholarship about whether it was deliberately buried.
Hmm.
Initially, the reports coming out said that it was. Then they kind of backed off that stance and they have possibly reversed it to say, well, it was probably just the pressure from the overburden
Hmm.
that filled in the site because the overburden was higher than the enclosures. The enclosures were underground, and then they basically just filled in the enclosure, and then naturally over the millennia, it just naturally filled in with the rest of it. I think perhaps after studying this site extensively, going on 6 years now, I do think probably perhaps both is true. Why do I say that? Is because it looks like that indeed the pressure from the overburden actually collapsed and filled in. But before that happened, there are large stone heads. They're anthropomorphic stone heads that were deliberately placed upside down at the foot of the pillars and the enclosures. Now,
Hmm.
there's only been, I think, five, maybe six enclosures excavated, but some of these stone heads were deliberately placed upside down and then buried there.
Hmm.
We see this at Karahan Tepe, which is a neighboring site to Gobekli Tepe. And at Karahan Tepe, this is exactly what we find, that they have taken these large stone anthropomorphic heads, and they have some of the noses have been cut off, and they've been deliberately placed upside down and buried. So we know that's true for Karahan Tepe. I think it's perhaps true also. That's why I say at Gobekli Tepe, perhaps both is true, that they did bury these stone faces upside down at some point in time. We don't know when. And then the pressure from the overburden filled in, and then naturally the rest of it. So it looks like perhaps both indeed isn't true. But then you have to ask the question, why would they bury the stone heads upside down?
Yeah.
And we don't know, we really don't know, have a definitive answer on that. But
Hmm.
I theorize is that at some point in time after or near the end of Gobekli Tepe and the neighboring regional sites like Karahan Tepe and some other places, that the people there, or perhaps others who came and later found it after the sites had been abandoned, considered those either the activities or the images somehow taboo. And in order to prevent any further use, they took the stone heads, cut off the nose, placed them upside down and buried it. Those sites are very large, and I can't see people just backfilling that all the way to the surface. That it just there's I just don't think that's reasonable. Uh, that's a reasonable explanation.
Mhm.
But I do think they probably took the heads and some of the things and then buried what they could, and then just left it so that no one could actually go back and use that anymore. So as a way to, I think, defile the place, probably after the sites have been abandoned. But it shows that at least there was probably some consideration to what had happened at these sites and what the people were doing, and they didn't want anything else to do with it. So it was a way to prevent others from going back and reusing these sites. And matter of fact, at the end of the book, we postulate a little bit further on this about this very theory. But it's interesting that we do find this not only at Gobekli Tepe, but some other sites as well.
So interesting, isn't it? Do you think that that they built this before the flood, after the flood, before Genesis 1:1?
Yeah.
When?
So my co-author, Dr. Judd Burton, on the book, he postulates a pre-flood aspect to this, an ante-diluvian world aspect. Uh, I lean towards on the physical side and the use of Gobekli Tepe. It's post flood. It's post deluge.
Okay.
And here's the reason why is because the stones at Gobekli Tepe are limestone. And they found a quarry site about a quarter of a mile away where they had quarried these huge monolithic columns. They were T stone columns.
Mm-hmm.
The two central columns in enclosure D were 18.5 feet tall, but they're monolithic, which means there's a solid piece of stone.
Mm-hmm.
They were quarried from a quarter of a mile away, drug uphill, and then placed inside these enclosures in a vertical stance.
Right.
And so limestone is a sedimentary rock. It's laid down underwater. And because of this, the type of rock that we see there, which is limestone, that's all post-flood material geologically. And so I think it was definitely a post-flood site.
Oh, interesting. So then you both have a different point of view when it comes to
Well,
that.
yeah, Dr. Burton talks more in the book about the Watcher influence with
Correct.
Gobekli Tepe. That would be both antediluvian
Mm-hmm.
perspective
Mm-hmm.
and a post deluge perspective as well.
Okay. Very interesting. Now, there appears to be a connection with the Anunnaki, and you talk a lot about that there in the book as well. The Anunnaki and Gobekli Tepe. Who, for our listening audience, who are the Anunnaki?
The Anunnaki are um, they are seven Mesopotamian gods
Okay.
in the pantheon, and these gods are first mentioned that they're called Anunnaki, the sons of An, which is An, the sons of An, which is a deity god. The sons of An, and the sons of An had An had seven children, offspring, which were be considered these deities. The first one is Anu, which is the Lord of the Sky. Then you have Enlil, Enki, and you have some other ones as well. But basically, these are the top gods in the Sumerian pantheon, and we see that the first use of this terminology of Anunnaki, it comes out of I think third century Babylon, and on it's cuneiform tablets and cylinders that were discovered And this is where we see the first terminology of the use of the word Anunnaki, but the terminology is the sons of An.
Mm,
And so typically these gods were lesser deities. Some of them ruled the netherworld, what they would consider the netherworld, um, and the Anunnaki were revered as well as gods over the air, the sky,
mhm.
the water, the netherworld, the earth, and so they had different regional functions.
Right.
But they all, bowed the knee to the top god of the pantheon, which is the god An. And we make these connections in the book because there's some very interesting ties to the symbology, the symbols, the iconography at Gobekli Tepe, and this is why we kind of get into the Anunnaki perspective, which Dr. Klaus Schmidt initially thought there was a tie to the Anunnaki. Now, some scholars think that the Anunnaki were men who were deified as gods.
Okay.
Others think that the Anunnaki referred to the Watcher element, which would be pre-flood,
Hmm.
where the Watcher angels, and it talks about this in the book of Enoch. But the Watcher angels who left their first estate, it says in the book of Jude, these angels, these fallen angels, left their first estate, which means that they left their celestial abode and transformed into a physicality that they had to live out. They crossed a barrier that they were not supposed to cross, and because of that, they interfered with the affairs of mankind. They married women, and their offspring became the Nephilim.
Hmm.
And so we see that the sons of An perhaps were probably there's a consideration that the sons of An, these seven deity gods called the Anunnaki, were part of that Watcher connection that ended up were uh, two-thirds man but one-third God. And this is where we get the uh, the the connection between the gods of Greece and Rome.
Hmm.
The names change over the cultures, but the deities, if you march them back in time, really go back to some of these original deities called the Watchers.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask you about that. Someone that does a really great job of remembering and listing all of the different names of these gods and, depending on the culture is Derek Gilbert, who I know wrote the
Yeah.
foreword on your book. But I was going to ask you exactly that. So for people that don't know what the term watchers means, and of course, I'm glad you pointed out Anunnaki and where all that comes from and what it means. So, so basically, we're talking about that there could very well be a connection with the watchers and the Anunnaki, and that they could have been just um, worshipped, right? These watchers, again, these angels that rebelled against God and, passed a line where they never should have passed, rebelled against God and, meddled with with mankind, had intercourse with women, created demigods called the Nephilim, um, perhaps exchanged all this knowledge with humanity that they were never supposed to have. And so that's how we begin to connect those dots with perhaps the Watchers and the Anunnaki, is what you're saying, correct?
Right. And the tie to Gobekli Tepe with all this is not that it's a temple where they worship the Anunnaki. That's not what we're claiming.
Okay.
We do know in history that there were smaller temples set up for that later on in Samaria and Mesopotamia. But specifically at Gobekli Tepe, I don't think that's what they were doing. Um, One theory is that when your ancestor died, you would need to appease the gods, especially the gods of the netherworld, so that your loved one remained at peace and at rest in
Mm-hmm.
the afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would have to appease these deities by presenting offerings and libations to them. Not necessarily a worship, but to keep everything, nice and peaceful for your loved one in the afterlife, you would make offerings to these gods. And we're not saying that all these gods are found at Gobekli Tepe, but I do theorize that there are probably at least two that we see in the iconography that have very specific ties to the biblical narrative back in Genesis, which is very interesting. And if this is the case, we see, I think, perhaps that this is some of the earliest forms of religious ideology that we see in the archaeological record.
Mm-hmm.
And it really helps kind of fill in the gaps about what they were doing in some of these enclosures. And this is in particularly, we zoom in on enclosure D at Gobekli Tepe because that's been excavated and we know what's in that enclosure, which includes those two 18.5-foot tall anthropomorphic images in stone. They're faceless, but they do have arms that wrap around to the navel. They're wearing a belt, and in the front, they're wearing fox pelt loincloths. And there's particularly two of them. One up at where the neck would be has a bull cranium image, which is an image of a bull skull, which is a skull with the horns. And on the other, that's on Western Pillar 31. On the other pillar, just adjacent to it, is Eastern Pillar 18. And this pillar has a crescent moon image with the full disk, which is either probably a full moon or the sun. And then right above that is kind of an H-looking symbol. And so in the book, we theorize what this iconography is and how we identify it to the two stones there in enclosure D.
It's absolutely amazing. I know that we've touched on this already, but I did jot down a few bullet points from your book that I wanted you to expound on. You talked about that the site suggests that religious ideology came first, right? Before the
Yes.
development of agriculture. Are you said before though the current archaeologists that have excavated the site and have studied the site, are they now believing that this could be the case, or are they still in the mindset that it was the other way around?
I think they still hold to the conventional viewpoint of Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they have considered this because there's this is really the first site that challenges that viewpoint, that narrative. I think this is important when you're looking at all possible theories. I think this is important to consider that religious ideology came first because we know that Gobekli Tepe is situated on the highest point of the Jurmis mountain range, which
Hmm.
overlooks the ancient plains of Haran. Now, this is where Abraham, when he was known as Abram, he lives in this area called Haran. He gets called out of it when he's 75 years old.
Hmm.
How do we know that? It's because his father, Terah, dies when Abram is 75.
Hmm.
But guess what they were doing at Haran? They worshiped the moon god. This is a very area where Abraham was called out of, where they worshiped the moon god Sin. Now it's spelt Sin,
Mm-hmm.
but it's pronounced seen, like I have seen something.
Mm-hmm.
It's the moon god seen. We know that in this region, the moon god was uh, prevalently worshipped. In archaeology, we see often two male figures that are flanking a crescent moon image. We don't only see this at in Haran. This matter of fact, at the modern day town in this area today is called Shanlurfa. But also it's known as just simply in the Old Testament, it was known as Edessa, biblical Edessa, not Odessa, Texas, Edessa. So biblical Edessa. So this is where that area is. But they were worshiping the moon god there. We see in ancient Jericho, which is right along the same time frame on the conventional time frame of Gobekli Tepe, they were worshiping the moon god.
Mm.
So we see that the images of the heavens, at least at some point, have been deified in the moon. And this is where exactly we see on Eastern Pillar 18 the crescent moon image where the neck would be. Now, in in the conventional understanding of Gobekli Tepe, these are all, there are a lot of zoomorphic images on the stones at Gobekli Tepe. So you have vultures, serpents,
Yeah.
lions. You have a lot of different animals, scorpions that are represented. But you also have this other iconography that's just considered art motif. I'm postulating that's not art motif at all, but that's language.
Okay.
And specifically, this goes back to the language in an area called Anatolian hieroglyphics. And this is what we propose in the book, that the language or that the art motif on the stones is not art motif at all. It's language, and it's specifically Anatolian hieroglyphics, probably Luwian logograms. Now, a logogram is one symbol represents a word. There's other languages that did use very similar logograms that were similar to Luwian. I'm putting forth the theory that it's Luwian, but the Luwians were contemporaneous with the Hittites, so which was much further down the road on the timeline, not anywhere near the conventional dating of Gobekli Tepe. But it's interesting that the Hittites adopted these Luwian logograms, and the logograms were specifically used. See, they had a modern everyday writing that they used, but the logograms were a specific form of formal writing on monumental stone. So when you have a small area or a reserved area to write on stone, you have to get it right the first time, but you have to maximize your space that you have. So they would use this Anatolian hieroglyphics called logograms, so you could put a symbol that represents a word. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing on some of the stones at Gobekli Tepe. For instance, the H on top of Eastern Pillar 18 above the crescent moon and the disk, which either is a sun disk or a full moon disk, that's known together as a crescent star.
Okay.
There's some interesting ties to that, but right above it looks like an H. But when you look at it closely, it's not an English letter H, but it's more as if two people were joining hands together.
Mm.
And you're seeing a side profile of that.
Right.
In Luwian logograms, that H is translated into Latin as portal or gate, which is interesting. There's another specific Luwian logogram that we see on the stones at Gobekli Tepe. That is the logogram for Deus. That's Latin for God. And we know a lot of Luwian symbols that have been translated now, but a lot of the Luwian is still untranslated. So we don't know all of it. The Luwian culture is not all that well known. There's only a handful of scholars that specialize in this area called the Luwians, or in the Luwian language.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the interesting times because we're seeing Luwian symbols, logograms on the stones at Gobekli Tepe. Which, if that's Luwian, it's either there's only two possibilities for this. One, it's Proto-Luwian, and you have to push that all the way back to the Stone Age, which is going to be difficult to do. Or that's not Stone Age at all. You have to bring it forward much later in time, which puts it in the Bronze Age. So even though Gobekli Tepe looks like it's in the Stone Age, why? Because there's no pottery found at the site. It's all stone vessels.
Mm.
But if you consider that the people who lived at the site just used the natural resources around them, they probably, they had a lot of stone. And so what did they use? They used stone vessels and not clay vessels because that's what was around them. It doesn't mean that other people around ancient Mesopotamia were not already using pottery at the time, because in the Bronze Age they certainly were. So evidence of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So I think that we have to consider the two possibilities, but I'm really considering the secondary possibility that if this is indeed Luwian logograms on the stones, then we have to reconsider the dating, the cultural redating of Gobekli Tepe.
The site has been depicted as such a mysterious site many times. I mean, it's been used in movies and in episodes, programs, and things like that. Do you believe that there were, in fact, portals within the site? And, as you said, the H that was depicted there could have been a portal. Do you think that maybe that was the case there or in other sites?
I think specifically at Gobekli Tepe, I think if this is indeed Luwian logogram for portal, I think we have to try to understand why they would use that symbology
Yeah.
there, this iconography to represent this. Um, here's why. Here's why I think that they considered it. If this represents a portal, I think it's not uh, a portal. In other words, it's not like the movies that you see where you're watching the movie Stargate, or something, and then they go through a portal. It wasn't
Hmm.
like that. To the people in the Neolithic, religion was that it was very important to their everyday life. That everything that they did functioned around the eternities of
Hmm.
the afterlife. This is incorporated into their very culture, into their thinking, into their cosmology, and so perhaps a theory on this is that when your ancestor died, you wanted to make sure that the gods were appeased, so your
Hmm.
ancestor would have a peaceful afterlife without any trouble. You wanted them to have a smooth transition, and two, that they considered it a portal because the only way to attain uh, eternal life uh, was to be regenerated in the afterlife.
Hmm.
And so the portal concept, I think, could be this. It's a Latin term called axis mundi, which is this connection between heaven and earth that they viewed. And if we go back to the biblical narrative in Genesis, at the fall in the garden, there was a lost connection
Right.
that happened right there. There was two consequences that happened at the fall in the Garden of Eden. One because of sin entered in. Then you have two things that happen. One, you have a physical death, but two, you have an immediate spiritual death that happens.
Hmm. Hmm.
Later, they live out a normal life, but they die physically. This lost connection that they had with God continues after the flood. But now you have to think you're post Babel, you're post Nimrod. So now you have the first type of Antichrist and Nimrod that raises up, that actively rebels and says, we're going to get back at God for flooding it, all of our ancestors, and wiping out almost the whole mankind. And so we're going to build this tower. Matter of fact, God tells him to do a couple of things. He says, I want you to scatter and around the earth.
Mhm.
Don't populate. But they did exactly the opposite. They
Right.
populated, and they said, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to build a tower. We're going to build a city, and then we're going to build a name
Hmm.
for ourselves. And so this was in direct opposition of what God had instructed them to do. So they didn't disperse. They congregated. And so after the Tower of Babel event, probably some generations later, and I give two timelines in the back of the book in the chronology, the revised chronology for Gobekli Tepe, whether you're using the Masoretic timeline or the Septuagint timeline. I give two chronologies there. But after this dispersal event at the Tower of Babel, we see that people have already started worshiping other gods. This is the direct influence of the Watchers before the flood, but also after the flood, that
Mhm.
they have been deified. Now the heavens are deified, and the moon, animals such as the ancient auroch bull has been deified, and they specifically deified these two things that are related back to their original ancestors. And so when your ancestor died, there you had to transition them spiritually through a regeneration process. And this is the idea of the portal. So you would go back, so you would die, but then you would go to the netherworld, you would be regenerated. But the regeneration is this kind of spiritual death that you're going through. But at the end of that, the only way to get back to eternity, which they believe that they came from the stars, and so to be transitioned as a star deity, you had to go back through your original ancestors that would have the power to regenerate you back to the afterlife.
Wow.
And that was both through Adam and Eve, but specifically Eve.
Mm.
And this is the idea of the portal. So they have deified both of their original ancestors in Enclosure D, and the two 18.5-foot tall stone pillars there are actually deifications of Adam and the auroch bull, which they had deified as the sky deity of An. And they have deified Eve as a mother goddess on Eastern Pillar 18, as the crescent star represents fertility. And the H symbol is this spiritual portal between the two, so that when you die, she can regenerate you back to the afterlife.
Wow. When you talk about the beginnings of culture, dead ancestor worship, and all this that you just finished explaining, I can't help but think of how many cultures nowadays even practice, something if not something like that, maybe something different, or in a way, it's almost like it's repackaged. If you think about the Mexican culture, for example, they kind of do that, right?
Yes, they still do. Yeah.
They still do. I want to say it's the Japanese culture, but I'm not 100% sure. I believe they do
Yeah,
as well.
Right.
But my goodness, as you were talking a moment ago, I was reminded of, I grew up Catholic, and I came to know the Lord as soon as I got married, within just a couple of months after I got married. But I know with the Catholic Church as well, they believe that you have to hold a mass for your
Mm.
departed loved one, right? And you pray for them and you hold a mass in order for them to make it into the
Yeah.
kingdom, make it into heaven. So it's almost like a little bit of am I right with that? It's a little bit like if it's repackaged
Right. Yeah.
somewhat.
We see this in modern day cultures,
Yeah,
for sure. But this always goes back to the original concept of ancestor veneration
right.
or ancestor worship. Now, I don't know that they were worshiping
Like you
their
said,
loved
right.
ones, but I think they were, at least they had deified both the
Hmm.
original ancestors and these two central stones in enclosure D
Yeah,
that represent Adam and Eve. And so they would venerate their ancestors through the stones. But it was probably more in the process of like libations and offerings. I'm not saying any sacrifices were performed there, but we do know that they had a big megalithic feast. And back to Haran, these were wild grains. These were not domesticated grains. They were wild grains. The einkorn and the einhorn wheat, and then the barley. It was all wild. So we know it was before the domestication of the cereals
mm,
because the grains were very tiny and the hulls, it required just a little bit of movement and those seeds would fall out. After domestication and cultivation, those seeds became, the hulls became harder, and then it required threshing to get the seeds out. Because the hulls were hardened over a period of time with domestication of the wheat. So we know that these were wild cereals that they were harvesting. So this is before the advent of agriculture. But they did have megalithic feasts there. We see stone vats that they had barley in, where um, they were fermenting the barley into beer.
right.
And so these big megalithic feasts and things like this were probably at least in some way associated with either the time of the harvest or in libations to these Anunnaki deities that you would need to appease to keep your loved ones satisfied in the afterlife.
Mhm.
But matter of fact, in one of the enclosures, we see a stone vessel with a shallow channel groove for draining liquid.
Oh,
This was probably a libation stone vessel that was
right.
used exactly for this. So I think it's very possible that they were doing these type of activities. And remember, the enclosures were once roofed. They weren't open to the sky like they are now. They were probably roofed. And then there was a procession that you had to go through to enter with bench seating, circle seating around these enclosures.
Hmm.
Now, if they were roofed, you would probably take some kind of torch lighting in there with you, and that light from the fire would flicker and cast shadows on the wall and the floor of the stones. And when that light flickering probably happened, there was a lot of symbology in those shadows that represented those spirits of the stones.
Wow.
So it would seem to come alive to them in the shadows. A lot of the ancient terminology that was known as shades. This
Hmm.
is the spirits of the departed were called
Hmm.
shades. And so these are spirits, but these are probably representations of these spirits through these stones. Some of them probably in the animals that are represented on the stones probably represented guardian animal spirits for the departed, but specifically it would be a living embodiment of these stones through the ancestral spirits.
Now it's believed that the stones held supernatural powers. Is that right?
Well, they would consider it supernatural because, again, this is a veneration of their ancestors, the two original ancestors. Now, why do I say that? Because of the iconography of the bull and the crescent star. But both of these stones, uh, they uh, they have these foxpelt loincloths that they're wearing in front of them. Why would you represent a stone pillar wearing a foxpelt loincloth
Hmm.
if it were not going back to the original ancestors of Adam and Eve, who after the fall, when God came walking through the garden and asked them where they were, it wasn't because he lost them and couldn't find them.
Mm.
It was a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
It was almost like he was like a parent would say to a child, "What have you done?"
Right.
You know, he already knew what happened,
Yeah.
but he said, "Where are you at?" Well, we're hiding. Why are you hiding? Because we're naked. Who told you you were naked? And what do they do? So uh, they you know covered their nakedness, and this is exactly what we see on the stones and the anthropomorphic stone pillars centrally in enclosure D. These 18 and a half foot tall that you're standing in front of and looking up with this light, probably from the fire there, casting the shadows on the wall, covering their nakedness. This is the only way to get back to this connection with eternal life, but they have deified their ancestors to do it through a deification of Eve as the mother goddess and deification of Adam as the supreme god and in the Sumerian pantheon.
Wow.
So
That.
this is why they would consider this supernatural, because this is the only way in their minds to get back to an eternity connection with God. But they have missed the mark
Mm.
because of the influence of the Watchers had already had them worshiping these celestial creatures that had left their first estate and went into a physicality, began to be worshipped as gods at some point. And we see that this is a bleed over into their cosmology at Gobekli Tepe because they believe their ancestors, their gods, came from the stars. So
Hmm.
this is the symbolic belief system that they had in the supernatural, but they have actually deified the moon and the image of the bull
Mm.
to do it.
What God said not to do in the first place, not to
And
worship
that's why he
the
mentions
God.
in Jeremiah, you say to a rock, "You're my father," and to wood, "We came from you," and
Yes.
all that's and this is specifically why he tells Israel, "Do not build this altar, Joshua's altar, which I've been to.
Yeah.
Don't build Joshua's altar with hewn stone. You have to do it with unhewn stone. Don't make any graven images. All the
Yeah.
graven images were images of the gods of Egypt. And what do we see when they got upset with Moses and they didn't think he was coming back and they convinced
Hmm.
Aaron to melt all the gold? What
Yeah.
image did they make from that? Out came a golden calf.
Yeah.
They formed an image of a calf,
Yeah.
and the calf is very important going all the way through Egyptian history, but further back, the image of the ox or the bull actually has one of the four faces of the cherub. I'll
Yeah.
just put it like that. And we get into it in the book because once you see it, then you understand the the unseen realm behind what's happening
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
reason for this whole cosmology and ideology that the people at Gobekli Tepe had.
Wow. Fascinating stuff. What kind of tools do you think, Dr. Aaron, what kind of tools do you think they used to carve out the images on these stones?
Well, we don't know. Conventionally, it would be before anything. So they would, probably use stone to do it.
Yeah.
Uh, but um, but we don't know. If the conventional dating's wrong and it's Bronze Age, then this would be well within the use of bronze. But there's no bronze tools or anything found. There has been copper found at some of the other area sites regionally. There's been beads and jewelry, copper that have been found, and they're all Neolithic. So if right now it would probably just be how do they do it? We really don't know. How
Okay.
would you cut that megalithic architecture
I
from
know.
just using a piece of stone to do it. It's we don't have enough information
Yeah.
really yet to consider, but that's what we know now is it would, the answer would be stone. Going back to the Luwian logograms, back in 1943, there was another site called Kara Tepe. Now,
Hmm.
it's not to be confused with Karahan Tepe, but Kara
Hmm.
Tepe in 1943, they did discover Luwian logograms at that site. So Gobekli Tepe is not isolated. There's there's a connection to Luwian at another site,
Hmm.
which is interesting. So I think when you have to uh, weigh all the evidence, what we have so far, we have to at least put forth some new theories about the possibilities, and that's exactly what we do in the book.
When you look at the massive stones that were erected, you see these T stones and everything that you explain in your book. Do you think that there was some kind of divine intervention, or how would they have erected those stones during that period of time?
Yeah, that right. How could a group of hunter gatherers
Yeah.
erect this megalithic architecture that's not supposed to be there? We don't know. Um, Judd Burton postulates that it was the influence of the Watchers that
Hmm.
brought them this knowledge,
Yeah.
either before or during. But we certainly know that uh, listed in the Book of Enoch that it lists specifically what these Watchers were doing to interfere with the affairs of man. And the Watchers is just it's a terminology found in the Book of Enoch. But these are just Watcher class angels. Their specific function was to watch humanity and record.
Yeah.
But 200 of them rebelled during the fall. We know that because 200 are listed in the book of Enoch,
Hmm.
and we know that at least 200 of them made a pact on Mount Hermon and said that we are going to do this thing.
Hmm.
And remember, they regretted it, and they had a dream that there was 200 trees, and this big flood came and killed all of them. And they were really concerned, so they go to Enoch and said, "Hey, could you go to the Lord on our behalf
Hmm.
and see if there's a way out of this?" And Enoch doesn't really want to do it. He's very reluctant, but he does it. And he comes back and he says, "There's no hope for you because of this thing that you have done." They were a celestial creature, and because of that, there's no redemption for them.
Right.
And so they were condemned to die a physical death. And then when they died, they become disembodied spirits
Right.
to roam the earth. And this is where we see, um, you know, this habitation of possession, where possession takes it, form either in a person or an object or an animal.
Hmm.
But they're doomed to roam uh, spiritually dead, but yet having all the senses and the urges of human flesh, of a
Hmm.
physical form.
Yeah.
They thirst, they can't drink. They're
Yeah.
hungry, they can't eat. They want to rest, they can't rest. And so it's a it's a terrible thing, but God says there's no redemption for you.
Yeah.
And so this is the very evil nature why God has Joshua and going later afterwards wipe out the rest of the clans that
Yeah.
we see that come after the flood, because they have a very evil nature to them. So again, 2/3 man, but 1/3 God.
Hmm.
And so God commands Joshua and to wipe them all out.
Hmm.
So it's important because this is the very beginnings of trying to stop the prophecy of the virgin birth from happening. So if
Exactly.
you can pollute the gene pool,
Mm-hmm.
Well, how can you have a virgin birth with Christ coming through the a human line if it's all corrupted?
Mm-hmm.
So I get into that in another book called Alien Agenda: The Return of the Nephilim that I wrote back in 2012. And we get into more of this aspect of the giants and the Nephilim, if you're interested in that. But certainly it's these are these are biblical um, you know themes
Yeah,
that have touched base through all these cultures of the influence of the Watchers, and we certainly see the influence bleeding over into Gobekli Tepe.
exactly. Before we close, there is a chapter in your book. It's chapter 5. And if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and quote you here.
Yeah,
Um, I found this chapter to be really interesting. And on page 92 of your book, it's chapter 5. You start off here on the bottom of the page, quoting Dr. Michael Heiser, um, which I know the people that view Table Talk know who he is. I've often talked about him. But you mention here Michael Heiser, specializing in the Anunnaki, clarifies it going back to Anunnaki. There are no known temples specifically dedicated to the Anunnaki for the purpose of worshiping them. Additionally, no text suggests that offerings were made to the Anunnaki for worship. This is a lot of the stuff that we just talked about, right? While certain Mesopotamian temples did include chapels for the Anunnaki and other lesser gods within the pantheon, this arrangement was intended for the Anunnaki to worship higher deities. These offerings were made for the benefit of the deceased, like you said, the shade, not as acts of worship or adoration. In essence, these rituals were not about venerating the Anunnaki, but about appeasing them to ensure the spirits of the dead remained at rest. Exactly what you were explaining, but there's a reason why I wanted to read this part as well. And then you say, think about it. If you wanted your relative to enjoy a prosperous afterlife, you appease the gods of the underworld with a big ritual beer and feast. Yes, there is evidence that beer was fermented using wild barley found at the site. People came to this area because of its natural resources in the plain of Haran. They also came to the sacred stones to venerate their forefathers who gave them life, and secondly, to appease the Anunnaki gods who were the overlords of the dead with the power over them in the afterlife. And then here's the part I really want to hone in on, because I want you to just expound this before we close today. For example, Ham, Noah's son, was later identified with the sun god Utu, Shamash, in history. Nimrod and Merkah, Sargon, the mighty hunter, was elevated to the deity status of hunting and warfare, called Ninurta, and Noah was later remembered by the Egyptians as the original Horus, the king from whom the pharaohs had descended. When I read that part specifically about Noah and how later the Egyptians, that the Egyptians remembered him as Horus, I thought, wow, I did not know that part. And I know that through things that I've watched on, obviously, TV and the excavations that I've seen through Egypt and all, you see, the images of Horus. So this is Noah that they are actually worshiping. They've made him a god.
I think so. They did it with Nimrod. Now there's a couple of different uh, theories. One is they deified Nimrod as either Imikar or Sargon. Some people think it's Imikar, some people think it's Sargon.
Right.
But they deified him after he had died. Ham, they did this with the sun god, either Utu or Shamash. But Noah, the Egyptians deified Noah, through which all the pharaohs descended. And what's interesting is, I think before all this, you have deification of the kings or of people in elevated status. They are deified after death. But in Egypt, the pharaohs are deified as living embodiments of the
Yep.
god. So
Hmm.
they are God while they are alive.
Yeah.
So this is a different aspect of uh, of deification. They have deified the pharaohs as they ruled, and so I think it's interesting that the very name Egypt comes from the word Mizraim, which was one of the grandsons of Noah.
That's crazy.
And you still see the word Mizraim in Egypt, which is a biblical name for Egypt.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interesting ties to the deification of ancestors. But I think at Gobekli Tepe, they definitely venerated their ancestors through the stones, but specifically have deified the images of Adam and Eve and these stones,
Hmm.
wearing the foxpelt loincloths to cover their nakedness.
Hmm.
This is the only reason you would create a stone with foxpelt loincloths. The only reason would be to go back to the original context of what happened that was probably passed down in verbal form throughout the cultures. But it's exactly the same narrative we see that's written in the book of Genesis,
Yeah.
that the fall of Adam and Eve happened in the garden and God covers their nakedness.
Hmm.
And so we see that later on, these ideas about how to attain an afterlife gets skewed from the original plan of worshiping God. Now we have the first type of Antichrist come up with Nimrod. Now they're deifying other gods or
Hmm.
worshiping these other gods and the images of the moon and the bull god. And then later in Egyptian history, we see the sun.
Hmm.
We see the sun disk being worshipped as a deity,
Hmm.
then the rays of the sun being worshipped as a deity, and then the pharaoh itself is
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
uh, is a is actually deified
Hmm.
when he's alive. The pharaoh when the pharaohs ruled Upper and Lower Egypt, they wore a double crown. One was a serpent and one was a vulture. And Egyptologists for a long time, they still think that that's just a symbology of their rulership of Upper and Lower Egypt at the same time.
Hmm.
But actually, and that may be, but actually, what that symbol also represents is that Pharaoh's power over life and death with the images
Wow.
of the vulture and the serpent.
Wow.
So we see this deification in the Pharaoh that he is God and he has power over life and death.
Hmm.
This is why we talk about this in the book, but when a Pharaoh dies, he gets buried with all he has. All of his servants dies.
Hmm.
They kill the animals. They mummify everything. But on usually in the tomb somewhere are either guardian serpents. These are guardian throne creatures. In this case, in Egypt, they're guardian serpents, but they're guardian throne creatures to guard the pharaoh in the afterlife.
Hmm.
But they're represented as winged serpents.
Pretty
So
interesting.
we talk about that in the book as well. But all goes back to a central paradigm that connects all these cultures and even Gobekli Tepe to the original context of what happened in the book of Genesis. And so when I talk about the images, these anthropomorphic images, faceless, but they have arms, long arms that wrap around in the navel. Well, we see this at other sites as well around the world. At in Easter Island, it would be a famous example where these big monolithic, these big stone, faces and the big stones there, but their hands come to the navel.
Yeah.
This is a sign of this is the place of birth. This is a reverence sign when the hands come to the navel. This is saying that this is the place where we came from,
Hmm.
and so we talk about that the arms in archaeology is telegraphing, the arms are telegraphing divinity status.
Oh, wow.
So it's not, they are arms, but especially in the Ugaritic literature, we see that arms telegraph deity status, and and they all and the hands come around to the navel, and then we talk about we break it down in Sumerian what all this means and how it relates back to the deification of both Adam and Eve as these gods. And I think they have done just that. They have deified the image of Adam as the god An
Hmm.
and the Sumerian pantheon, who birthed the seven gods of the Anunnaki later, and the deification of Eve, the mother goddess, who they have deified with the crescent star, this crescent moon, and probably the sun disk above that would be considered a crescent star. It was a fertility symbol that's later represented in Mesopotamian Sumerian cultures as the god Inanna,
Hmm.
Ishtar, and Ashtar worship. It's the same deity, it just changes names over time. This
Hmm.
deity is still into play today, where you often see the image of Baal, you often see the image of the female deity along with it. And in the
Hmm.
very back of the book, here on Decoding Gobekli Tepe, we talk about in the afterword how this all comes together for us in the present day and what this means. Because again, when you see the image of one, you often see the image of the other deity at play, and we actually are seeing that female deity goddess in today's culture now that's still relevant. And I think this, interestingly enough, this female deity can change genders.
Hmm.
So she can go between male and female, which is very interesting to the cultural complexities that we have here now in our society. And again, when you see the image of one, you see the image of the other. And
Hmm.
this, I think, plays in right into the times that we're in now. And
Hmm.
that should really give us a warning about why all this is important and how to be spiritually ready and spiritually fit for the times that we live in.
I'm so glad you pointed that out because, again, you have to connect the dots in order to understand why the culture is the way that it is nowadays, right? And I'm glad you mentioned that about Ishtar and Nana, the Baal as well. And we see this, prominent thing happening now that maybe 10 years ago was not as in your face, right? In the culture. We talk a lot about, how abortion is the same as Baal worship, sacrificing your children to Baal. And that's what abortion is, basically. And we talk also, at least in our church, we're very open when we talk about things like that. We see the transgender movement as well, and that goes back to the influence of this goddess as well. So I'm really glad you ended it that way because a lot of times people wonder, why is the culture the way that it is? Why is the world changing the way that it is? And why is there so much evil and things of that nature? And the fact of the matter is that we see the influence of these deities still at work today. It wasn't just a thing back in Old Testament times or whatever. No, it's still at work and still influencing people, the culture, the world today.
Yeah, yeah. We make all these connections in the book Decoding Gobekli Tepe. I think you're going to really find it fascinating. We're not, we're not saying emphatically this is the way it is. Again, only 10% of the site's been excavated. They're now slowing down excavations actually at the site,
Mhm.
which is a bummer
Yeah.
because if they just would have kept at the current rate, you're looking at about 150 years just to excavate the whole 22 acre site.
Wow.
And now they're slowing down excavations. But look, if these ties that I'm making in the book are correct, and they are theories, and I acknowledge that. But if evidence bears out that what I'm proposing in the book is in case fact, then I think you have to reconsider what the Bible has to say
Hmm.
in the very beginning. So
Hmm.
if you've had any doubts in the past, this is where archaeology has confirmed a lot of these events, times, places, people, battles in the Bible
Hmm.
as factual, empirical evidence. Then I think you have to consider what
Yeah.
Genesis has already stated,
Yeah.
that one, we were created by God, who
Hmm.
desired to have a family and to
Yeah.
have fellowship with man,
Yeah.
uh, and and uh, and two is to be about our Father's business, not only here but in eternity.
Right.
And this is exactly the offer that the Watchers and the fallen angels did not get.
Hmm.
And we were undeserving of that, but God sent his son to die for us to take our place for sin, that something that we could have never done.
Hmm.
But this is exactly the story of the gospel and redemption in the Bible, and that we can have fellowship with God again. And I think that's the whole central concept in this is our connection with God.
Hmm.
And God desires to have fellowship and relationship with us, just like he did with Adam and Eve in the past.
Right.
But they fell out of fellowship with him because they sinned. So God makes a way of redemption for that to happen through his son Jesus Christ. That offer is still extended to us today,
Hmm.
something that the Watchers never got.
That's right. That's right. And that's a gospel story right there. Well, I
Yes.
can't wait for the trip in June to go visit this site. In particular, I think it came right on time. God knows everything and sees it all, and He knew that we were going to be visiting it. And this book came into my hands right at the right moment. We met right at the right moment. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you writing it. I appreciate you coming on for the second time with me because now I can take all of this information and bring back some content while I'm at the in Turkey in the Gobekli Tepe site. So I can't wait. I can't wait to share with you as well what we
Yeah.
saw and pictures and all those kinds of things. So I want to thank you so much once again for joining me. And for those watching, go get this book. Can you tell the audience where they can find it and also find your other work, your other book, and support your work and your ministry?
Yeah, it's called Decoding Gobekli Tepe. Ran number one on Amazon in archaeology for new release and in prehistory. But it's Decoding Gobekli Tepe. It's now available on Kindle. If you want it on Kindle, it's all on Amazon.com. And you can find my work centrally at aaronjudkins.com. Just my first and last name, aaronjudkins.com. You can go to my Substack .com account. It's Aaron Judkins. I think it's aaronjudkins.substack.com. But if you just type in my name, it'll all pop up. A lot of free content there, articles that I'll send out once or twice a week. And then over at our Patreon site, you can go to Ancient Pathways. We got a lot of free content there as well, such as what we call the Ancient Library, digital library. I've got several volumes just on giants.
Mhm.
I've got several volumes on just ancient historical manuscripts, like the entire Septuagint in digital format, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the complete
Nice.
Dead Sea Scrolls in English. It's all available for your download. Several other things that we've done, movies and video content as well. But I ask that if you enjoyed the book and you learned something, we ask that you just go back to Amazon and write us a review and that really helps push the book through Amazon, and we appreciate that feedback. So don't forget to go back and write a review for us.
Definitely will. And all of those links will be in our YouTube channel, so you can follow along with Dr. Aaron. Thank you once again, Dr. Aaron. I appreciate it so much. And we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you.
And be sure to like, subscribe, and share this content. We'll be back next week. Take care.